had already discussed this plan with his military commanders. But the Führer, of course, had no idea about this. By the way, Mikoyan wrote in his memoirs that Stalin outlined the general plan of Citadel to him as early as March 27th. Soviet intelligence was well aware of the German strike, becoming a huge advantage for the Soviet troops. In 1941, Soviet intelligence also informed the USSR leadership about the Barbarossa plan, including the invasion date. But Stalin saw this information as a provocation, aiming to incite deadly clashes between Germany and the USSR. He believed that Hitler would not dare to break the non-aggression pact and engage in a war on two fronts. In 1941, Stalin made a severe miscalculation. In 1943, the intelligence data was assessed. Based on this information, the Soviet command developed a sound strategy to counter the imminent offensive by the Hitlerites and immediately began executing their plan. This plan consisted of organizing a deliberate deep defense with the aim of exhausting and bleeding the advancing enemy, followed by a decisive counteroffensive. Therefore, Operation Citadel was deprived of the element of surprise. The Soviet soldiers performed a titanic task. In the sectors of the future offensive, they built as many as 6 defensive lines, dug thousands of kilometers of anti-tank ditches and trenches, set up firing points, and created an unreal number of minefields. General Melentin, who was the chief of staff of the 48th Panzer Corps at Kursk, recalled, "The speed with which the Russians laid mines was incredibly astonishing, and remarkably fast indeed."
In the Corps' offensive zone, we diffused tens of thousands of mines each and every day. We had to advance through an extremely continuous minefield.
It is also important that the results of this enormous effort were successfully hidden from German aerial reconnaissance, misleading the enemy about the exact location of the main defense objects and their depth. The entire battle consisted of 2 phases, defensive and offensive. According to Soviet command's plan, the defensive phase of the battle took place from July 5th to July 23rd, 1943. Rokossovsky's Central Front troops defended the northern phase of the Kursk salient. Vatutin's Voronezh Front troops held the southern face, while the troops occupying the salient itself relied on Konev's steppe front. But the main events unfolded precisely on the flanks, on the northern and southern faces, because the Germans attacked there, from the areas of Orel and Belgorod towards Kursk. The offensive for the Hitlerites did not go well from the beginning. As soon as they started preparing for their artillery barrage, they themselves were hit by a massive and effective counterstrike from Soviet artillery. The counter preparation was carried out at 3 a.m. on July 5th by the forces of 2 fronts simultaneously. It disorganized and demoralized the attackers. The Germans were unable to achieve rapid breakthroughs and decisive strikes against the Soviet forces. They got bogged down in deep and layered defenses, advancing only slowly and with heavy losses, while the Red Army soldiers put up stubborn resistance. On the northern face of the Kursk salient, Walter Model's strike group penetrated the defense by only 12 kilometers, and got bogged down in bloody battles, losing up to 2-3 of their tanks by July 10th, either destroyed or temporarily out of action. Initially, the German offensive on northern face advanced along a wide front of 45 kilometers. In their attempts to break through the Soviet defenses, they kept narrowing it. By the 3rd day, the front of the offensive had shrunk to 15 kilometers. On July 8th and 9th, the advancing front was only 2 kilometers, and by July 10th, they were no longer able to advance any further. On July 12th, on the northern face, the Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive, and the Germans had to urgently bring up reserves to counter it. On the southern front, events unfolded in the same manner. On July 5th, the German troops advanced, but their offensive momentum lasted only until July 15th. Then they became exhausted, and from July 20th, the troops of the Voronezh and steppe fronts jointly began to drive them back. Traditionally, the climax of the Battle of Kursk is considered to be the largest tank battle near Prokhorovka. On the southern face of the salient, where on July 12th, 2 tank armadas clashed in a fierce encounter battle. The Red Army had about 800 ISU tanks, while the Germans had 311, although the data from German and Soviet historians differ significantly. From July 10th, the Germans, gathering all their forces, changed the direction of their main strike and began to successfully advance on the southern face of the Kursk salient. To meet them, the front commander Vatutin deployed the 5th Tank Army under Pavel Rotmistrov. Her counterattack stopped the German tanks at the Prokhorovka railway station. Indeed, the mystery of this battle is that both sides exaggerate the number of losses. Soviet historians talk about the victory of the Red Army tankers and manage to claim on paper the destruction of more German tanks than were in the whole 2nd Tank Corps of the Wehrmacht that participated in that battle. And there were even more Tigers than in the entire 4th German Tank Army advancing from the south. German historians, on the other hand, present monstrous figures of Soviet losses, portraying the event as a victory for the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. In Germany, the battle near Prokhorovka is considered a complete and utter slaughter and destruction, with Tiger tanks and the new modified T4 tanks featuring reinforced armor protection, superior Zeiss optics, and highly effective and powerful 88mm guns, as well as very experienced and well-trained crews. The German tankers systematically knocked out the Red Army tanks advancing in waves. The Soviet tankers could only engage these tanks at close range, desperately maneuvering and flanking them. However, there was no room for maneuvering on the field near Prokhorovka. He was limited by ravines and a railway embankment, so most of the Soviet tanks couldn't even get close to the German ones and were shot from long distances. In fact, the Soviet tank army indeed unsuccessfully attacked two incomplete German tank divisions, losing approximately 53% of its 642 tanks and self-propelled guns in one day of fighting. But if the Germans had won that battle, and the Soviet tankers' victory is just a propaganda trick, then why were the Nazis forced to urgently retreat after Prokhorovka? In general, if you compare the Soviet and German descriptions of the battle on the Kursk salient, you might think they are talking about completely different operations. After Stalingrad, the war from the German side is described as an unbroken chain of heroic battles against countless hordes of Red Army soldiers, who constantly recover from crushing defeats, successfully repelling their onslaughts and launching counterattacks. The Wehrmacht repeatedly stabilizes the front, yet for some reason, it keeps retreating further and further west. Soviet commanders and historians also exaggerate German losses, and the truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. Nowadays, the huge numbers of German losses at Kursk are dismissed as fantasies of Soviet propaganda. But it's obvious that the figures provided by Western historians can't be trusted either. If the German losses were relatively small, then why did their front collapse? And why did the Nazis retreat? This happened because the strength of their units significantly dwindled, because the losses in manpower and equipment were very significant and difficult to replace. The second phase was offensive. The fact remains, it was after Prokhorovka that the Soviet troops went on the counter-offensive. This was the turning point. The second phase of the Battle of Kursk consisted of several successful offensive operations, ultimately allowing the Red Army to finally taste the long-awaited victory indeed. During the offensive operation Kutuzov, which took place from July 13th to August 18th, the Hitlerites were driven back to the Hagen defensive line, east of Bryansk. They liberated a number of cities, the largest of which was Orel. The troops of the Central, Western, and Bryansk fronts participated in this operation. From August 3rd to 23, the Voronezh and Steppe fronts conducted the Rumyantsev offensive operation. They defeated the Belgorod-Kharkov group under the command of Manstein. They liberated the Kharkov industrial area of the city of Belgorod and Kharkov itself. In honor of the liberation of Kursk and Orel, first celebratory salute history of Great Patriotic War took place in Moscow. Operation Citadel was the Wehrmacht's last attempt to seize strategic initiative in the summer of 1943. After its failure, this initiative permanently passed to the Soviet army. This is why the Battle of Kursk was the conclusion of the turning point in the Great Patriotic War, which began with Stalingrad. And why did Germans suffer defeat at Kursk? Write your opinion in the comments, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. All of this will greatly help its promotion.